of our series called Let's Do Dinner, in which we've been following Jesus around to different places where he shared a meal and leveraged those moments to teach important words of life to his audience. And as we've seen so far, in almost every instance, Jesus left a profound impact on those that he shared a meal with. Sometimes he used the opportunity to correct, someone's behaviors or perspective, such as he did with Mary in week 1 of our series, or the Pharisees in week 2. Other times, like last week at the home of Zacchaeus, he left him with words of encouragement and provided a strong sense of belonging. And I promise you today, by the way, that I will not sing a song like I did last week. So anybody wants to check in on that one, that will be downloaded today on the Facebook website. So anyhow, today's mealtime moment, though, has several different unique differences. And for one, instead of being the one invited to eat a meal at the home of an excited host, Jesus here today plays the role of the host and the cook. Second, instead of a midday or an evening meal, this one involved an early morning breakfast. Third, this one takes place after the resurrection, not before the resurrection, like the rest of the stories we've looked at so far. And finally, instead of taking place in someone's home, this one takes place on a beach. Now, having lived in the Bay Area of California for 5 years and in the Tampa, Florida area for 15 years, one of my favorite things to do, as Jennifer can attest to, was to eat at restaurants by the water. I still love to do that. I just love the views while I'm eating, just looking at the water and the boats or whatever. And I'm always willing to pay a little bit more for that kind of experience. And on at least 1 or 2 occasions, when we lived in Florida, we actually went on some dinner cruises for a couple hours. Now, for me, there's just something that's kind of particularly intimate about eating a beachside breakfast to start the day or a seaside supper to kind of end the day, especially if it involved the beautiful sunset. I don't get up early enough to see the sun rises. So anyway, but the beautiful sunset I love to eat on the beach with. And I don't know if Jesus used this setting to intentionally create an ambiance of intimacy or not, but as I read the story, that's the word that kind of jumped out to me about this particular environment. The events that take place definitely create an unforgettable, life-changing, intimate experience for one man, at least in particular, and that was Simon Peter. And throughout this encounter, Peter no doubt has experienced a broad spectrum of emotions in a very short amount of time. Memories of great moments and not so great moments come flooding back to him. We see him start off in the story as one who's perhaps a little lost and possibly looking for answers. And no doubt as the night goes on, he's going to become a little frustrated, although that's not told to us in the passage. You can't help but feel his frustration as an unproductive night kind of seems to drag on and on. And then in an incredible moment that brings back a great memory, we see him become extremely jubilant. But a short while later, that's followed by some deep sense of grief. And Jesus gives him a little insight into his future. You might even be able to add a little fear as well. This was no doubt a physically and emotionally exhausting night for Peter. So again, the story we're going to look at comes from John chapter 21. And as we read through the story together, I kind of want to encourage you to try and maybe empathize with Peter a little bit. Put yourself in his shoes. Through all the ups and downs of the events and the words of Jesus go on. Bearing in mind that Peter has had a heck of a week already, right? I mean, within the last 10 days or so of this event, he's denied being associated with Jesus. He stood by helplessly and watched him get tortured and crucified, knowing he could do nothing about it. And then he saw his resurrected friend on a couple of occasions, and yet still has no idea what it all means or where he's supposed to go from here. Perhaps it's that kind of sense of lostness and unanswered questions that led to the setting of this story, which begins when Peter announces to his friends his intention to go hit the boat in the sea for some night fishing. And that's where the story begins in chapter 21, verse 1. It says, after this, Jesus revealed himself to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which is also known as the Sea of Galilee, that we know it as. And he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, the author of this book, and 2 others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said, well, we'll go with you. Now, there's a few commentators and teachers who claim that what Peter did here was wrong and reflected a lack of faith. And I don't think anything can be further from the truth. In fact, I think that kind of conclusion reveals more about the judgmental attitude of those who think that way rather than Peter's true intention. To be honest with you, I can actually relate to Peter's actions here. Have you ever had a season or two in your life when some big decisions you made or some course you were on did not go the direction you thought it was going to go? Maybe you made a big move, or you chose a new career, or even got married, and sooner or later things just kind of seem to be come unraveled a little bit. It didn't work out the way you thought. And in that moment, you feel a little lost. You're not really sure what to do next. You have no immediate answers. You feel no sense of control, and you feel very extremely unsettled. So what do? Well, for many people in that situation, in some way or another, they return to what's familiar. Maybe they move back home, or they go back to an old job that isn't their lifelong goal, but at least provide an opportunity to kind of settle things down a bit. I can remember a few occasions when that happened to me. That might be what you're going through right now. I don't know. But a year and a half after taking on my first full-time ministry as the youth pastor, I found myself out of a job for a completely unjustifiable reason. In my naive mindset, I never expected in 100 years to feel that kind of hurt in ministry that I did in that instance. And at that moment, I wanted no part of ministry anymore. The thing I spent 4 years of training and turned out to be nothing like what I envisioned or expected. And I was bewildered, I was frustrated, I was lost, I had no idea what to do next. So I did what a lot of people do. I moved back home to kind of get my bearings straight. Several years later, fast forward, and I'm living in California, and I meet the woman of my dreams, decide to move to Florida and get married Jennifer. And for a year and a half, I ran into job after job that fell apart for one reason or another. Many of them in Florida are scams, when you find out very quickly when you move down there. But going through those experiences was not normal for me. We were married for less than a year, and my sense of stability and confidence in who I was, or what I was able to be as a husband or an immediate father to a 5-year-old little girl, all but just evaporated. So when my brother-in-law offered me an opportunity to kind of come back to Indiana and work for him again, and Jennifer had the grace to say yes, we moved back here for a while, for about a year, but it allowed me to regroup again. And I think this might be what's going on at this moment with Peter. I think that's why he goes fishing, right? He has no idea what the future is supposed to look like, or how to interpret what the resurrection was supposed to mean for him at this point. All he knew was that they didn't seem to be doing ministry anymore, and he had a family to take care of. There was some economics involved, and nothing about his future was really clear at that moment. And besides the economics, it may have also been where he did his best thinking, right, to contemplate his future. Sometimes that's what, especially for guys, we kind of sometimes think better when we're at work. So to me, it makes perfect sense that Peter would go fishing at this moment. Just some insight into that part of the story. Reading on, he said, they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And just as the day was breaking, Peter stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that, or Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now, there's really nothing mysterious to read into this. Right? It's just early morning. It's probably a little foggy or misty. Jesus is the length of a football field away and not exactly wearing a jersey that says number 1 on it. So they probably, could not make out who it was. They could see a figure but not really tell who it was. I also can't help but think that Peter might have been feeling a little bit more defeated and depressed at this moment. I mean, you just ever had those days when nothing goes right for you? I mean, here he's in his field of expertise and he can't even catch a fish. So, that's just already you're feeling kind of down and everything else, and now you kind of just feel like a complete failure with everything you touch. And that might have been what Peter was going through. We don't really know. That's a little bit more conjecture. But Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, well, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Now, the term that Jesus uses to call out to them here is interpreted as children, is really the first sign of him creating a very intimate atmosphere. It's a term of endearment. And not knowing who was speaking to them, it's interesting that they actually cast the net. But there's a couple of possibilities as to why. One, at some point out of desperation, you just might be willing to try one more time because somebody said to do it, right? So that might be it. Maybe they were just desperate, that couldn't hurt. Second, it may not have been entirely unusual for someone from a different perspective from the shoreline to see a school of fish that those in the boat couldn't see. Sometimes that happened, but I don't think that's the case here because he's 300 feet away and it's early morning. I doubt that's the case. My guess they just complied because, well, it couldn't hurt. But when the fish started filling the net at an unprecedented rate, they knew that it was nothing short of a miracle. These were professional fishermen. They knew this wasn't normal. John was the first one to come to the realization. We know that because of the way he identifies himself in the next verse. He said, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is the way John always identified himself, said to Peter, it is the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. Now at this point, whatever Peter had been thinking about, whatever his frustrations were about the unproductive night of fishing, whatever feelings that he might have had about the future and not knowing what's going on, all of that went by the wayside. And a quick memory of the first time he ever met Jesus and knew that he was in the presence of God himself came rushing back. It was one of those deja vu moments. You remember that scene, right, from Luke chapter 5? It was really similar to this moment here, very eerily similar. Perhaps even in the same area. Jesus was teaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd were pressing in. And he noticed two boats of fishermen who had just come from another unproductive night of fishing, and they were washing their net. And the boats were owned by none other than Simon Peter, known only as Simon at that point. And Jesus asked Simon to take him out into the water a little bit so he could teach from the boat. And when he finished, he asked Simon to go out deeper and let out the nets again. You might remember at first Simon said, we fished all night already with no success. Then maybe he saw the look on Jesus' face or what, we don't know. But something in the way that Jesus spoke moved Simon to say, okay, because you say so, I'll throw the nets out again. And that catch was so large and so obviously a divine act that it caused Simon Peter to recognize he was in the presence of the Lord. He turned to Jesus and he went to his knees and said, Lord, go away from me. I am a man full of sin. That memory comes rushing back this time. Peter couldn't wait to get close to Jesus again. He had been fishing here in bare minimal clothing, probably a first century version of something like a swimsuit or something. But then at that point he had the presence of mind to grab his outer garment and to jump in the water and start swimming to the shore. Now I doubt any of us today would take a moment to put on all of our clothes and a jacket and go jump in the water. That just makes it harder to swim. But in the first century it would be considered extremely distasteful and disrespectful to go to see someone in bare minimum clothing. And although I don't think Jesus would have cared, that's the last thing that Peter wants to do. So he grabs his clothes and he leaves the others to tend to the fish and row the boat in. And that's where we pick up the story. It said the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. For they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. And when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard, and he hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Now at this point, Peter's initial excitement had kind of subsided a little, and he goes back to the boat to help the guys haul the net in. For some reason, they seem to have taken a moment to count and possibly divide the fish. And John, the author, recorded the exact number of fish and makes sure to mention that these weren't just small bait-sized fish. These weren't little minnows or goldfish. They were large, edible fish. Now, often I've told you that whenever the Bible mentions a specific number, we kind of need to take note of it, because usually there's a high probability that it means something significant. This here seems to be one of those exceptions, though. Nobody really knows of anything of what 153 points to. Some commentators, even as far back to the 4th century, have tried to find or even create some kind of mystical or spiritual meaning to it. I won't go into all the different things they've come up with, but most of the suggested explanations usually point in some way to the universal outreach of Jesus' ministry. It's possible, though, that the number just meant something to those guys. For example, it's very possible that it was the exact same number of fish caught in the story in Luke 5, but we don't know that. But that number is not recorded, right? So we really don't know. Or maybe it's a completely different number, so as to make sure that those with knowledge of that first time know that this was a different story. Or it's possible that being a fisherman himself, John just recorded the number so that the readers of his time knew the improbability of catching this many large fish at once, and that they could appreciate the magnitude of the moment. If we let the text speak for itself, that kind of seems to be what John is doing. He's just pointing to the fact that there's so many large fish and yet the net didn't break. Maybe another small miracle of the story, we don't really know. In any case, 153, as far as we know, doesn't really mean anything. But another important part of the story I don't want us to miss is how Jesus invites them to bring some of their fish and add it to the fire. To me, that's interesting. It's not like Jesus would have been surprised by the number of fishermen on the boat, right? And underestimated how much food he would need to cook. I mean, that's just not like Jesus. He would know how much he needed to cook. So but yet he invites them to bring some of their fish as well. And whether it's intended or not, I think Jesus might be asking them to do this. I think this kind of points to an important, maybe subtle principle. And that is that God always provides, and he can do whatever he needs to do and needs to be done without our help. But he invites us to be a part of the process. And he expects us to contribute that which he has gifted us with, whether it be our talents, our skills, our time, our money, or anything else. Jesus invites the disciples to be a part of this meal together. We pick it up in verse 12. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and he took bread and he gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. You ever wonder if they ever ate anything else besides bread and fish in the first century? I mean, it seems like every story we read is bread and fish, right? And no mention of tartar sauce. I don't know, I just had my observation. But anyway, granted, we're on a seashore, and it makes sense here that they would be eating bread and fish. All right, but nevertheless, this is one of those times where they do. I do know at the Passover they probably ate lamb. However, this is the third time that Jesus appeared to a partial or full group of apostles after the resurrection. But we're also told elsewhere that Peter had a private encounter with Jesus after the resurrection. So for Peter, this would have been the fourth time he saw him. But it isn't until this setting when things between Peter and Jesus get intense, as we're about to see. And although it doesn't specifically say this up front, it's seen from verse 20 that upon finishing their breakfast, that Jesus and Peter kind of go for a little walk away from the rest of the guys for a private chat. So let's listen in as he tells this part of the story. In verse 15, it says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. Then he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now, there's a few things to unravel from this conversation. For starters, notice that Jesus addresses him as Simon, not Peter. And I don't think it was Jesus pointing to a demotion of sorts or intended to make Peter feel guilty, but rather I think it was Jesus mercifully meeting Simon where he was at in the moment. Remember, the name Peter means rock, right? And even though Peter was excited to see Jesus here, and no doubt enjoying the intimate setting, he's still coming fresh off of the denial of Jesus just a week or so before. I highly doubt that Peter felt much like a rock at this moment. He could probably still see in his mind's eye that look that Jesus shot him when the cock crowed. Remember that part of the story? When he denied him and Jesus looked at him and all of a sudden he realized that what Jesus said was coming to true. He may have even wondered if Jesus had much use for him anymore. Have you ever felt that way? Or maybe I should ask, how many times this week have you felt that way? I feel that way every week, right? I mean, can Jesus still use me? Did I mess up again, right? Another question is, what did Jesus mean by, do you love me more than these? What is he talking about? Well, there's a couple possibilities, actually. One suggestion is that he's referring to the other apostles at the breakfast. Remember, sometime before, Peter had boldly declared that if everyone else left, he wouldn't leave. He was here to stay. And yet he did. And not only did he leave, he denied he even knew Jesus under intense questioning. So it's possible that Jesus asked the question to kind of bring Peter back down to earth a little and remind him of his own weakness before he kind of made some bold claims. I really don't think that's the case in this one, though. I don't think that's where Jesus is going with this. Another possible explanation that I kind of side with is that Jesus is referring to the boat and the fish. You might recall in the story from Luke 5 that Jesus told Peter that he would turn him from a fisherman into a fisher of men. And now it seems that Jesus is once again reaffirming that mission for Peter. But Peter has to make a decision. Would he rather choose the security and the familiarity and the probability or the predictability of a fishing career? Or would he rather choose what Jesus has in store for him? A lot of people would never leave their hard-earned success or their field of expertise to venture into the unknown territory of ministry. It takes a deep love for Jesus greater than that what we have for our career or anything else. And so to me, I kind of think this is what Jesus is pointing at. I think he's saying, you really love me more than your boat and your fish and this job, because I'm about to call you to do something that's going to be pretty risky. So when Peter felt lost and unsure, he came back to the familiar. So I think here Jesus is telling him in a subtle way, you cannot keep coming back to these things when things get rough. I need you all in. In other words, does he love Jesus enough to leave it all behind? Does he love Jesus unconditionally? And that brings up the third significant part of this conversation. The first two times that Jesus asked Simon if he loved him, he uses the word agape, the ultimate unconditional love. But interestingly, Peter responds both times using phileo, the idea of brotherly love rather than the ultimate expression of love. And some have suggested that Simon just couldn't bring himself to say it because he knew how he was now acutely aware of his capacity to fail. The third time Jesus asked Simon if he loved him, Jesus then downgraded to the word phileo. Again, it's possibly just trying to meet Simon where he was at. And the text says that Simon is grieved the third time because he asked the question. Is he grieved this time because Jesus needed to ask it 3 times, or is he grieved because Jesus didn't use the word agape? In other words, maybe it was like, realize I can't love you the way you asked me to love you, at least not right now. I can't claim that. All right, we don't really know. Many have suggested that this was the purpose of Jesus asking, that part of the purpose of Jesus asking 3 times was to make up for the 3 denials. I don't really know that. But I do find it interesting that Jesus responds to Peter's answers a little differently each time. Feed my lamb, shepherd my sheep, and feed my sheep. Now, is there something about the progression that's significant? It seemed to me that Jesus might be pointing to the idea that Peter is to introduce people to the gospel message, that's the lambs, help them to mature into shepherding, but yet continue to teach them even during and after maturity. It seems like a little bit of progression there. Now, that's just some conjecture on my part, to be honest with you. The one thing we do know for sure, however, is that Jesus is officially reinstating Peter in this process and undoubtedly calling him to full-time ministry once and for all. It's time for him to let go of that fishing trade as a full-time gig. And that's not to say he couldn't use it from time to time the way Paul did with his tent making when financially necessary. But his heart must be fully leaning toward ministry going forward. He must be all in. He must love Jesus in a way that's agape, more than just the phileo kind of love. And then in full disclosure, Jesus reminded him that the mission he was calling him to came at a cost that he had to be willing to endure. It's almost like a one last, are you really sure kind of thing. In verse 18, Jesus gives Peter a not so subtle peek into his future, and it wasn't the prettiest image. He said in verse 18, truly, truly I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And then in parentheses, it said this was to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And then after saying this, Jesus said to him, follow me. Now, understandably, this makes Peter question whether he alone would have to go through that, or would the others have to endure that kind of suffering too. And like many of us, Peter gets caught up for a moment in the comparison and fairness game, right? But Jesus said, kind of quickly squashes that whole line of questioning. In verse 20, he says, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. This is why I think they might have been on a little bit of a walk. The one who had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? In other words, John is kind of referring to himself here. But when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this guy? Jesus said to him, hey, listen, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You just follow me. So the saying spread around among the brothers that this disciple was not yet to die, meaning John. It was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but rather, if it is my will until he remains until I come, what is that to you? And this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, there are many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, real quickly, in this story, what can we take away from it this morning? Well, first and foremost, I'm comforted by the fact that Jesus is the Lord who is full of mercy and grace, even in the midst of our deepest failures and our deepest flaws. I'm really glad, aren't you? Because I've got a lot of them. I'm comforted by the word that this same author wrote in another one of his letters known as 1 John, that if we confess our sins to God, he is faithful and he's just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all wickedness and unrighteousness. I'm thankful that my failures don't completely eliminate my usefulness to Jesus, because God knows I have plenty of them. And like Peter, sometimes it's hard for me to claim that I love Jesus unconditionally when I know that I have such a capacity for failure. And yet, for a while at least, Jesus is okay with that. He will meet us where we are, and he'll help us walk the journey to maturity while using us for the kingdom purposes at the same time. That's the beauty in this promise to Peter. He understands that Peter can't quite say that yet, but he's still willing to use them. Feed my lamb, tend to my sheep, feed my sheep. In the process, it's important that we participate, though, in intimate moments like we see here in John 21, so that we can have those private moments with Jesus, to walk through that process together. Jesus uses those times to give us opportunity to reaffirm our faith and to reaffirm our calling. The second thing I would take away from this is let us not forget that what Jesus called us to. That while he promises an abundant life and one that is not burdened with a lot of rules, he did not call us to a life of ease, but yet one of sacrifice. In some cases, the ultimate sacrifice. But in doing so, he called us to a life of purpose and meaning and mission. We may very well go places we never intended to go or be thrown in the midst of potentially hurtful circumstances. We can't be naive to expect that it will be a bed of roses like I did so many years ago. There are times when ministry is painful and sacrificial, and nevertheless, what did Jesus do? He says, follow me anyway. right? He told Peter basically, you're going to die by crucifixion one day, but follow me. That's calling us to a life of mission and sacrifice, but also one of purpose and meaning. And third, it's critical not to get caught up in the comparison game. It's not ours to worry about how God uses other people, or whether he blesses them with a longer lifespan or either more visibly productive ministry. And that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow, even for guys like me. You know, if I'm being honest, it's sometimes a hard pill to swallow. But in the intimate moments, it's important to reorient our focus on what Jesus has in store for us. Let us not be the one talent servant that buries the talent in the sand. If we have one talent, let's invest it all that we can, right? Whether it's 2 talents, 5 talents, whatever. You all know that story. We are instruments used for God's purposes. And only he can see and determine how our life or our death plays out in the greater scheme of things. Our job is to simply to follow. And that was the whole message for Jesus, for Peter here. Don't worry about your failures. Don't worry about your flaws. I'll take care of those. Just follow. Let's pray.